Hey folks, it's October 14th. It's Tuesday. I had to start with this view today. This is looking down. We're just off the coast of California here, zoomed in on a vigorous upper level trough connected to a low pressure system at the surface that actually prompted a rather rare severe thunderstorm watch overnight, kind of before the recording of this video for like the greater Los Angeles area. And just kind of looking closer there have been severe thunderstorm warnings. There might be one active right now. We'll take a look at that in the all hazards map in just a second, but I think maybe the bigger story here is this low pressure system. The trough associated with it is not only going to be impacting California today, where it's brought rain over the last 24 hours, gusty winds to the coastline, obviously, potentially severe thunderstorms, but snow to the Sierra Nevadas, particularly the southern Sierras, which had comparatively less moisture, less snowfall, and water getting into the reservoirs last winter. So curious to see California getting a quick start to their water year. That we kind of think of their wet season starting maybe at the beginning of October, lasting anywhere from like March to April in 25 and 26. So starting quickly here, which was a broader concern with La Nina as the background state. Climate Prediction Center just officially declaring La Nina last week. Typically, California struggles more so with drought and a lack of snowfall. But curiously, at least this year, October, starting a bit quicker. Now, I do want to jump over. This is kind of the zoomed in view, but sometimes I think these deep low pressure systems almost look more impressive, like zooming way back. So you can see North America on the right side of your screen. It's actually a typhoon way over in the West Pacific on the left side of your screen. Hawaii's down here at the bottom. You get this big broad view. See that jet stream emanating off the near remnant typhoon here in the West Pacific. This deep trough here west of California, bringing all that moisture not only into the state of California. There's showers across a wide area across the plains here today. If we jump over and look at the radar, you can see the moisture streaming into California. There's a coastal range which runs kind of along the western edge of California here. A lot of the moisture getting up into those mountains, and then some of it into the Central Valley. And then at the higher elevations, kind of not captured by the radar here, snowfall getting into the Sierra Nevadas as well. If we look at those upper level winds, not hard to identify that trough, situated somewhere just off the coast of San Francisco here, pretty well co-located vertically with that surface low pressure system below it, the ridging downstream of that, and the plains bringing warmth this week to the middle part of the country. A relative lack of rainfall, unfortunately, for the southern plains, southern Mississippi Valley, where we've seen drought built in kind of over the last 4 to 6 weeks here. And I do want to jump over. This is the latest Storm Prediction Center. They do have a marginal risk for severe weather out here for Southern California today. Separate risk area for New Mexico. So not, particularly notable, not like one of these slight, enhanced, moderate risks that we'll get, in the Midwest or the Eastern U.S., but still marginal risk for Southern California, not terribly common. And that's largely due to this tornado threat, and a little bit of a wind threat as well. Hail, fairly unlikely today in California. I do want to see, we see that severe thunderstorm watch. That's in that kind of pink, dark pink color. And the more proper pink color, there's those winter storm warnings for the Sierra Nevadas. Have frost advisories for portions of the Willamette Valley in the Seattle-Tacoma area. Then looking east, not too much going on in the eastern part of the country right now, but we do have some wind watches as well for Southern California, Las Vegas area. Look at the continental U.S. view for radar. There's that moisture getting in east of the Continental Divide. So out ahead of this trough, spinning over California, there's that downstream ridge. So there's flow coming north across this area. And really this trough is something that's going to be, part of our forecast conversation the whole week, all the way out, even through Saturday, maybe even to Sunday. As it intensifies, it's going to come off the elevation to the west. It's going to amplify into the northern plains, into Canada. We're going to have to talk about snow, potentially for Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and then bringing winds into the middle part of the country over an area that's had a lack of rainfall. We just talked the central part of the country warming up this week, so you have increasing winds. It's warm. We've had a lack of rainfall. There's a fire weather risk component to this low pressure system. And then Saturday, if I jump over and show you the Storm Prediction Center outlook, I just showed you it for today on Tuesday, but let's jump all the way out to this Saturday here. This would be October 18th. And the Storm Prediction Center highlighting a pretty wide area for potential severe thunderstorms, anywhere from northeast Texas all the way up into southern Illinois. As this trough intensifies further up into Canada, it's going to leave a cold front draped all the way back across the United States. And if that can amplify a little bit on Saturday, you could be talking about a wide area of severe weather. So that's returning to the conversation here after a long, a long period here at the end of summer, a lack of flow, lack of momentum, and very little to talk about in terms of severe reports. Just quickly catch us up on the last 24 hours of rain here. The nor'easter finally making its way off screen. We didn't see it there on the continental U.S. radar view, just kind of lingering showers here near Cape Cod and Boston. We can see that rainfall getting in, particularly in New Jersey, eastern Massachusetts. Some light showers over the Midwest here over the last 24 hours, and then better rainfall amounts near the Four Corners region. Look at California. I mean, that is roughly 50% of the state here getting some sort of like measurable rainfall, which is not common from all of these systems. You can see the whole kind of northern, central, and south central coast. And this area is going to fill in today. We'll look at that closely as well as that rainfall streams in off the coast. If we take a broader view, just look back across the last 60 days of precipitation departures. Eric did a great job yesterday of talking about the changes in the flow, the lack of momentum, how we shift this time period out of that summer precipitation regime into the winter one, where we're looking for more proper troughs, proper low pressure systems, talking about those cold fronts, which I just mentioned, potentially coming through Saturday. If we're going to work back a lot of this drought that's built in here over the last kind of 2 to 3 months, you're going to need more of these on the map, more of those low pressure systems, cold fronts associated with those. If you get kind of just north of the low into what we call the Drought region, more so a winter kind of storm configuration, you can get heavy rain and precipitation that way. So those are the systems that we'll be watching the forecast. Now, I'll spoil it before jumping ahead. You get to this part of the video, you're going to see more on, looking out into the 10-day forecast. But we're seeing more of that as momentum has predictably increased. We talked about that typhoon activity in the West Pacific, these mountain torque events over in East Asia. With more jet stream activity, it's just more chances to get precipitation into the middle part of the country. I expect that to improve the water situation here, even if the forecast doesn't look, markedly wetter right now. I'll talk about why I say that in just a second here. I did want to show this. There's kind of two different ways to look at this drought building in. One, we just look at the last 60 days of rainfall, but I love looking at the 8-week drought monitor change. So this is the USDA drought monitor, but looking at its trend over the last 8 weeks. And this is almost, I think, more revealing as to where things are going, how dry it is versus just the flat drought map. Because this tells you the areas that are rapidly drying out. So you can see areas in the Midwest along the Ohio River Valley. We talked about New England finally getting some rainfall from the nor'easter event. And then the southern plains, the southern Mississippi Valley. This area, even more so recently, has been seeing those warmer temperatures, drying out. We talked about that fire risk later this week as those winds pick up. It's really kind of this corridor in here that I'll be worried about. But we'll look at that in a second with the wind forecast. In fact, I'll just jump over. Let's do that now if I can find those winds. This is from the GFS here. So this is going to be the maximum cumulative winds will stick on the map here. So you'll see this kind of fill in this week as that low pressure system comes off the Rockies on Friday. You can see the winds pick up into the 40s across the plains. This is now getting into Saturday. Winds picking up across Illinois this weekend, and then next week with some more troughing activity coming through, more low pressure systems. You can see values getting into the 50s in Iowa. So this corridor here, worried about some fire weather risk over the next 7 days or so. I do want to jump back. This is the ECMWF forecast. So I'll show you what I'm talking about with those troughs and low pressure systems coming off the Rockies here. I'll start this. Let's do 7 a.m. Tuesday, roughly around the recording of this video. There's that low pressure system that we talked about. Heavy rainfall moving into Southern California. Snow getting into the Sierra Nevadas, which was hard to see on the radar, so it was too high up. And then there's those light showers spreading across the Central Plains here. So take this forecast forward through this evening. Light showers continue across Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin today. But really waiting, now getting through Wednesday. That low kind of stuck within the Intermountain West here. You can see it starting to organize. We get down into Thursday morning. There it is, South Dakota. It's kind of weak as it comes off, and it starts to increase in strength. Now down to 992 millibars from the ECMWF. This is now Friday afternoon. So he's starting to see some of that snow change over here on the border, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and potentially Friday night. Looking at a swath of measurable snowfall accumulating here on the backside of that low. Remember I mentioned that kind of, we call that trowel region. A trough of warm air aloft is what that stands for. You get good ascent, you get heavy snowfall here in winter, and a lot of precipitation. But there's that cold front where I talked about. We need these L's back in the map, 988 millibars. That's a deep low pressure system. There's the cold front associated with it. Initially, don't see great rainfall values kind of unzipping down the line here. This is now Saturday AM, but you'll notice, watch the uptick in precipitation rates here from the ECMWF model. We're going to talk about why that is in a second. You see this precipitation filling in here now Saturday afternoon from Illinois through Missouri. Talked about how dry this area has been, eastern Missouri into the Ozarks, now through Arkansas. And what was a pretty skinny, looked like one of these weak cold fronts that's going to move through, and those accumulations were going to slowly evaporate moving east, has been so often the case over the last 4 weeks. It's actually filling in, getting stronger. And what's happening here is the trough responsible for this initial low pressure system is getting a kick from the Pacific jet stream, that uptick in momentum from the Pacific jet stream. You can see that vigorous low now getting into British Columbia. This is now Saturday, but there's an extra piece to it that's rounding the base of this trough here and kicking this cold front, giving it second life. It's actually almost forming its own secondary low pressure system. You have the original occluded one here, as we call it. It's pretty stale, frankly. And we have a new low pressure system trying to develop here over Arkansas. This is now Saturday evening, and that's prompting that SPC, that risk for severe storms. And you can see how impressive some of these rainfall rates are. That's why that storm prediction center, plenty of moisture, flow coming around. It has a kicker. You have, maybe even its own low pressure system here. You have a recipe for severe weather. And that moves all the way through. You can actually see a secondary low now spinning up here over Ontario. And widespread rainfall values, all the way from Arkansas across the eastern U.S., drying out as you go further to the south along that front. This is now Monday morning, that low spinning off over Maine, New England, and then potentially middle part of next week, another low pressure system trying to develop as we go through next week. Another one of these troughs, less of a cold front component with that one, but given, we're also a week out, don't want to talk too many details with that one, but likely seeing another system coming on shore next week. All right, let's try to sum that up quickly just in the 5-day precipitation anomalies from the ECMWF. As that low consolidates, moves north across Manitoba, see that snow captured here, a lot of the widespread rainfall in this corridor here. And that initial cold front, right, wasn't that heavy widespread rainfall now showing up. This only takes us out, right, it's a 5-day forecast. It's only getting us into the early part of Saturday. But as I go out 7 days, see that cold front gets reinvigorated, starts to fill in this corridor here. Looked at the drought change, how dry this area has gone. Unfortunately, Texas, the Southern Plains, missing some of this. But go all the way 4 to 10 days. Now you see some more rainfall getting into Texas and Arkansas here. Let's see if we can see actually some of that potentially a system coming out of the Southern Plains next week was captured in that 4 to 10 day. And then we'll sum it all up. There's the 10-day precipitation anomaly. With that next system next week, right? We looked at that Tuesday, Wednesday coming out. Remember, it didn't have that, better southern component of rainfall to it. And it's for that reason this area kind of is trending back toward dry over the next 10 days, despite the wet forecast here this weekend. So we'll have to see that next low if it kind of skirts across the border here, brings rainfall to the upper Midwest, or leaves this area dry. And this kind of area in between, missing that system next week. Maybe going up a little bit drier, but we'll talk more about that in the long-range forecast in just a second here. I did mention that kind of piece to the Pacific jet stream, and I want to talk about that because that's going to bring, I think, uncertainty to the forecast here. Zoom this in a little bit. We're looking at the North Pacific jet stream here. This is from the ECMWF. There's our current system here. I'm taking this forecast out a little bit. Let's take it out to Tuesday around lunchtime. Keep an eye on this jet streak here. So that's an increase in those jet stream level winds. Kind of a smaller area there. There's this current trough that we're going to be watching. All right, I'm going to play this forecast forward. Trough comes off the elevation. We actually have a weak low pressure system initially over South Dakota. That strengthens into that 990 low with that potential snow on the backside of it, Canada. And this trough here, looks fairly weak. That low now moving all the way up into Canada. And this initial configuration, not fantastic for rainfall through this corridor. But keep an eye, that jet streak now rounding the ridge here over British Columbia. It's diving down. It's kind of hard to see, but it's diving down now through Wyoming. Pushing into the Southern Plains, and it's reinvigorating the trough now. You can see that uptick in that jet stream activity as it rounds the base of this trough. It's helping to form that new low pressure system across the Ohio Valley Saturday evening. There it is, pops up over Michigan or Ontario by Sunday morning. And again, worried about severe weather in this corridor here. The exact details of it are going to become more clear as we go through the week here. But there's the ingredients are there for severe thunderstorm warning, or I should say severe thunderstorm setups this weekend, certainly. And then that story, I talked about that Pacific jet rounding the base, reinvigorating the cold front, throwing a wrench into the forecast for this weekend. It continues, right? There's this next system we talked about. Look at these jet streaks here. Those are all on their way, right? So if I play this forecast forward, here comes that next trough. This is now next week on Monday to Tuesday. We talked about that racing across the upper Midwest. Didn't have that, better southern component to rainfall. But if you time up, again, one of these little jet streaks with the base of that trough as it's coming through, that could kick up, better cold front activity and bring a better quarter of rainfall to the Midwest. We'll have to see the timing of it. But 976, that's a very deep low over Lake Superior. And then potentially another one of these troughs here. This is all the way out Friday of next week, way too far in the forecast to have the specifics. But again, you can see that kind of look where you have potentially a jet streak rounding the base of the trough, maybe kicking in some rainfall chances for the southeast. And man, look at this jet streak now across the North Pacific. That is, you're getting up into the upper echelons of how quickly you can move flow through the atmosphere, up high at that jet stream level. And this is related to that mountain torque we talked about. Remember, after the 20th, the 21st, we're expecting that uptick in momentum, the Pacific jet stream. And that is an extreme Pacific jet stream that's going to extend later out into the forecast and all the way near the end of October. And this has to go somewhere across the continental U.S. So I'm not going to talk about specifics, which area this is going to impact, whether we'll see an atmospheric river for the Pacific Northwest, whether it dives down into one of these huge cold fronts, bringing severe weather, rain, or snow to some parts of the U.S., but something like that is likely as this jet stream pushes all the way across the continental U.S. near the end of October here. So curious to see how this all plays out. There's definitely a lot of momentum in the atmosphere, more to talk about. I talked about, just think about the hazards that we had to cover today: fire weather risk, wind, anomalous severe thunderstorm watches for Southern California, severe weather getting back. We talked about drought. We talked about snow. You're starting to see, as momentum picks up, the list of things that we need to account for start to grow. And if I take this forecast from the ECMWF ensemble, I'm starting already next week because I wanted to show you that trough that we're watching coming through the upper Midwest next week. You can see that increased jet stream behind it, the trough over Alaska. And then by late next week, there's that extension. You can draw the jet stream between these troughs and the ridges here. So with the strong ridge, strong trough, right next to each other, we know the jet stream is going to be cranking. Right now, some of the long-range forecasts have this ridge setting up over the middle part of the country. That's not uncommon out in front of these extensions. Cooler air on the backside of this trough as it comes through late next week. This area is going to look drier and warmer in some of the forecasts, but this extension's got to go somewhere. And so the ECMWF ensemble is not clear on where that's coming across, kind of actually fades it out and leaves a lot of that momentum coming through kind of the northwestern part of the continent, but it's also well out into the forecast here. And I think it's just washing out a number of the different solutions that could be coming through here. So you can kind of see that if we just look at Eric talked about this a little bit yesterday, but the 8 to 14 day precip forecasts from both the AAFS, the ECMWF ensemble, here on the far left, the GFS ensemble, they don't show any super strong precipitation signal except the upper Midwest here from the AIFS. That's not an ensemble, so it's not surprising to see that with a bit stronger of a forecast. But generally this area here, the wettest, excluding the west coast of the continent. So expecting with that momentum, a lot of it to be deposited, if you will, or come racing through the northern part of the country. But it's not to say that this area is going over bone dry. In fact, the only bone dry colors you're going to find are over the Gulf here from the AFS. There's going to be chances. There's going to be cold fronts moving through this area. And it's possible that Saturday setup with some of them getting reinvigorated into their own low pressure systems. You see the southeast going over wetter in some of these scenarios as well. The southern plains, portions of Texas seeing better precipitation signal in some of these ensembles. The 8 to 14 day outlook from the Climate Prediction Center actually going above average slightly for the middle part of the country. Not, there's a disagreement, if you will, right, between the Climate Prediction Center forecasters and the 8 to 14 day panels on the right, and that they're not buying into as much of this, drier forecast here. They're not even showing a dry contour, say, for parts of New Mexico and Arizona. So with that momentum, more chances again for precipitation to move through here. Now, if I scroll down and look at the temperature cards, if you will, On the far left, those are the next 5 days with that low pressure system consolidating just off the elevation in the central part of the country, warmth spreading up into the middle part of the country. Remember, I identified that area like right here. I know this is very small on the screen at this point, but really kind of circling the southern plains, or the central plains, I should say, to the western Midwest for fire weather risk on Friday, particularly concerning, maybe even a little bit on the back side of the low as it comes through on Monday. The temperatures will be cooler, but if the winds pick up, that fire weather risk can remain elevated, especially depending on precipitation. But as we go on into next week, another system moving through now, so temperatures starting to fall, but not looking as warm, especially with the later in the week behind the system, cold front bringing frost chances potentially to the middle part of the country. And then looking further out, 10 to 15 days, that's that kind of pivot point where we know that jet stream is going to be racing through here. You can actually just see it in those Pacific surface temperature, that forecast here. So as that's come racing through, does it dive out into a trough in the eastern part of the country? From the AFS, something more akin to that. The GFS, a little bit warmer, certainly for the middle part of the country, still a little bit cooler for the east. Warmer over Canada, and then the ECMWF ensemble, much cooler for the eastern U.S., keeping a lot of that warmth more so over like northern Canada at this point in the forecast. So a lot of disagreements with how this jet stream extension and that jet streak is going to make itself felt for the continental U.S., and that's just the nature of it being a 10 to 15 day forecast at this point. Frankly, we don't have that high confidence. But what I do know is some impactful weather is likely coming to the continent as that jet streak moves through. I wanted to touch a little bit on winter here as I wrap up. As we start to transition from October, November, into December, there's going to kind of be this second forecast paradigm shift that occurs as well. Eric just did a great job yesterday talking about the shift from summer forecasting to kind of cold season forecasting, if you will, which we've now transitioned into. But we also look at something more so for the harder winter called the polar vortex. Now, this is well up into the stratosphere, looking at winds way, way above our heads, much higher even than the jet stream. And if we go up to that level, we can start to see the polar vortex taking shape over the North Pole, fittingly. Now, right now, it's actually a little bit weaker. You can see it's actually kind of squashed a little bit more toward Europe, and that it typically runs a little bit more like this. You can see it's a little bit squashed. It doesn't make this kind of perfect circle, if you will, somewhere here over the Canadian archipelago. And some of that likely due to the warmth that we're seeing in the North Pacific might be weakening it some. That's going to be significant for the winter forecast if it remains to be the case, although I have some questions about that I'm going to address at the end of this. But right now, a little bit weaker. Now, we don't look at the polar vortex, admittedly, too much in October. We start to think about it more as like a hard winter December, January, February phenomenon. But it's something to keep an eye on, because if we look at the strength of it over time, at least starting out here in October, and even in the forecast, which takes us almost to November, looking at this pink line here for the current strength of it, we're actually below average right now for that polar vortex. Now, I mentioned that a second ago. If that remains to be the case as we go through winter, you're talking about potentially a more impactful kind of cold shots of air, more of those kind of anomalous snowfall events in the U.S. kind of later on. But last year was interesting. Last year, 24-25 is in blue on this map. Similarly, here in October, we were below average, but as we shifted into November and December, when the polar vortex starts to drive more of our wintertime pattern, especially with respect to temperatures, it was actually above average from November all the way through December. It wasn't until we got into the new year, even like through February and then into March, where we started to see these weakenings, these stratospheric warming events that we talked about. We saw the anomalous weather occur all the way down to the Gulf Coast states, some of those crazy cold fronts and severe weather that we had in early March. Partially responsible was this polar vortex. So curious to see where this goes. Do we kind of repeat what we saw last year, and this polar vortex just suddenly strengthens in November into December? Because if that happens, that tends to keep that cold air where it belongs. So a more, stronger vortex here, you can kind of think of it like a jailer, a gatekeeper on the cold air of the Arctic. But when it weakens, it allows that cold air to spill out into the mid-latitudes for the U.S., for example. Now, last year, if we just look at the November to December temperature trends, let's call this like early winter, with that stronger polar vortex warmer across much of the continental U.S., in almost every climate division. But if we go out into January through March, which is when we started to see these weakening events, much cooler from January and February and then through March in 2025. Now, that is just one scenario that played out last year, but I'll be watching that. This is something that we'll be keeping an eye on in the forecast here as we transition November into December. I'll mention briefly the tropics here. We did have Tropical Storm Lorenzo spotted here in the central Atlantic. Now, the good news here is it's going to follow a similar story that a lot of these storms have, where it's expected to stay out to sea. And with that being the expectation, don't want to spend too much time on it. There is another area of interest that the National Hurricane Center has identified with a chance of formation in the East Pacific. That wouldn't shock me given how much activity that we've had over here. We'll have to keep an eye on that, but not looking like one of these strong systems that's going to come up and bring a ton of moisture into the southwest. But we'll have to keep an eye on it. If it uptrends a bit versus some of these forecasts, that might come into play again in the forecast. I did want to talk about La Nina quickly at the end of this. Eric did a good job covering it yesterday. But one thing I'm watching as it relates to that polar vortex conversation is all the cooling that we've seen in the North Pacific. And with that jet stream extension expected in the forecast, deeper low pressure systems coming through this area, we saw just in the, not the sea surface temperature forecast, but in the air temperature forecast above the ocean. Let's see if I can pull that back up. How cold we're getting in the North Pacific. So those two things are linked as well. So those are temperatures coming down there. More reason to think that over the next 10 to 15 days through the end of the month, this area is going to get even colder, which is interesting because of how warm it was at the end of summer, Japan reaching its all-time national temperature record earlier this year. Cooling in the East Pacific due to all the tropical activity there. We're getting through a number of the alphabet storm systems here. And La Nina looks, as strong as it has recently being named. Doesn't look like fading La Nina anytime soon. So curious to see how this plays out. That polar vortex weakening conversation might be impacted by this because sometimes we look at North Pacific warmth going to disrupt that polar vortex. But at least the trend over the last 30 days, potentially the next 15, is that the North Pacific here will remain cooler. That could invigorate some jet stream extensions over into the western U.S., Pacific Northwest specifically. But at least right now, this kind of La Nina pattern that we're in with the variable but extended Pacific jet more so over the Northwest here, it's been interesting to watch, and it's going to get busy, I think, through the end of the month as far as these videos go. We're only going to be using the whole amount of time here. I think that's my last slide for today. I appreciate you watching, and Eric will talk with you all on Wednesday.